Check this out. This is the before and this is the after. Want to know how I got from this to this? Stick around because I'm about to show you my Lightroom Classic editing workflow for wildlife photography. I'm Sai Pathy. I'm a wildlife photographer based out of Houston, Texas. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I edit 4 of my favorite recent wildlife pictures in Lightroom Classic. I hope that this video inspires you to get out there and capture and edit some of your favorite pictures. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the recording. Now, I do want to mention a caveat. I am going to assume you have a little bit of exposure to Lightroom, so this is not going to be totally beginner level. It's more so you kind of understand my philosophy in how I edit my pictures. And these are the 4 pictures we're going to edit today. I've got an egret here, a great blue heron, and then a mallard, and then finally a green jay that I got at the La Lomita Photography Ranch. So let's go ahead and get started with this egret. The first thing you want to do is go into the develop area, and I start all my pictures this way. I go to lens corrections first, and I click on remove chromatic aberration, enable profile corrections. This just cleans up anything that the camera or the lens might do to the picture. So that's a good starting point. And the next thing I start with is going to be adjusting the white balance. I know people use this dropper tool to get the white balance, but I like to put my own number in the white balance area. I typically start with 5600 because that's natural sunlight, and I'll put 5600, and if I don't like it, I'll start adjusting that number. So let's go ahead and do 5600 here. All right, that looks pretty natural. I'm happy with that. I'll tell you the next thing I don't particularly like about this picture is all of this twigs and shrubbery and this other egret nesting here. It just, I think, distracts from the picture. So I'm going to try to clean that up by clicking on the remove tool. Let's make the size a little bit bigger. And then I'm just going to highlight everything I want gone from here and see how our AI friend does with the selection. Okay, so our AI friend let us down a little bit. We need to add more to this selection. So I'm going to click add, and then I'm going to add all of this area that it missed. And then I'm also going to add these 2 twigs and click remove. And let's see what we can do. Well, with a little bit of AI and some video editing, this is kind of what we're seeing now. I'm okay with that. I'm going to go ahead and click generate and see if it generates appropriately. Perfect. I'm kind of happy with that, so I'm going to get out of the remove area. And the next thing I want to do is really crop the picture. I'm going to use this rule of thirds to crop, but understand this is a creative hobby and you're allowed to be creative. Rules are meant to be broken. So if you're going to be happy with your subject being in the middle of the picture, go ahead and do it. Who cares? Have fun. This is a creative hobby. So I'm going to try to be in the rule of thirds, but if I don't like it, I will kind of do my own thing. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to see what that looks like once I press enter. Okay, I'm happy with that. And the next thing I'm going to do here is try to mask the subject. And I know I could kind of click this mask subject, but what I find Lightroom doing constantly is it'll select sort of this branch that this bird is on. So what I'm actually going to do is click object and select the bird myself and see what it does. See, it's still got some of this, so I'm going to subtract that with the brush tool. And just kind of subtract it there. Okay, I'm fine with that. Want to see if I can bring up the exposure a tad. I want to bring up the contrast a bit, and definitely want to bring the highlights down because this bird is white and I want some detail there. Maybe bring up the shadows a tad. I want to bring the blacks down. I like bringing the blacks down because it just makes it more punchy, particularly in the darker areas. Next, I want to bring the saturation up. So this is, again, it's a white bird. There's not a whole lot of colors, so I'm not gonna do any color corrections on here, but I do wanna bring up the texture a tad, wanna bring up the clarity a tad, and the dehaze a little bit. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. The next thing I like to do when I'm editing wildlife is zoom in on the eye, and I try to mask it with a brush tool. Let's make the size a little bit smaller, and then I select the eye. And I like bringing up the exposure a tad, contrast a tad, and then saturation a little bit. Perfect. I like that. Now, let's see if we can work on the background a little bit, but I want to do it by masking by color range, and I'm going to pick this green. Okay, that's what I wanted. What I'm gonna do is bring the texture down, the clarity down a little bit, and the dehaze down a little bit. And then I wanna go into the basic editing area and bring up the exposure just a tad. Perfect. Now what I would do here is basically export it to the medium that I need it for. So if I want it for Instagram, I'll export it for Instagram. If I want to print it, I'll export it for print. If I want it for my website, I'll export it for my website. Now what you're going to notice is it's kind of important to have the fundamentals down on the picture outside of the camera, because it makes the job of editing much easier. And you don't want to make these animals and birds and subjects look unnatural. They're quite beautiful just out of the camera, so you want to be careful with your editing. So this looks pretty good. I'd be done here. Let's move on to the great blue heron. All right, so same concept as the last picture. What I'm going to do is go to lens corrections, remove chromatic aberration, enable profile corrections. Quite like that. It was already shot at 5600 for white balance. I'm going to leave it there. Let's work on our crop. I want to bring it a little bit closer to the subject. I don't want this in there, so let's make it a little bit closer. Let's see what that looks like. All right, I'm kind of happy with that crop, but what I don't like is this little light here, so I want to remove that. Let's go into remove area. Let's make the size of this selection tool a little smaller. Let's select the object we want out. Perfect. I'm going to click remove. All right, pretty happy with that. I'm going to go ahead and generate that. All right, now let's get to working on our subject. Again, I want to click on the masking tool. I'm going to use the object and try to select the subject myself. And let's see how Lightroom does. Okay, I could live with that. Want to bring the exposure up just a little bit. Definitely want to bring the contrast up. I mean, this is a colorful bird. I like the blues and the yellows, so I want that contrast to be high. Bring the highlights down a tad. Bring the shadows up a little bit. Let's bring the blacks down a tad. And then bring up the saturation a little bit. Perfect. I do want to make that beak stand out a little bit, so I'm going to use the point color tool and bring up the saturation on the beak, and then also bring down the luminance. I want to do the same thing for all of this pretty blue this guy has. Bring the luminance down. Perfect. I'm happy with that. We'll bring up the texture, we'll bring up the clarity, we'll bring up the dehaze. And again, I want to get close to the eye and use our masking tool with a brush, and let's make the size a little bit bigger and get this eye. Let's bring up the exposure, the contrast, and then the saturation. So one important thing to note here, if you look, when we zoom in like this picture looks really noisy. I do use noise removal tools. I particularly use Topaz Denoise. I know Lightroom has a denoise tool as well. I think it's really important to use denoise because it makes the picture clearer, especially if you want to print a large print. And with Topaz, you can actually sharpen the subject a little bit, so that all adds to the vibrance of the picture. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to print it big, you want to use something to get rid of the noise, because when you go back to a smaller size, the picture looks pretty fine to me. The next thing I want to work on is the background. So let's create a mask for the background. Okay, did a pretty good job. Again, I feel like the bokeh here is good and everything's pretty good with the background, but I want to just help the camera out a little bit. So I'm going to decrease the texture, clarity, and dehaze. I like how that looks. Again, I want to increase the exposure a tad. There we go. Yeah, and that's it for the Great Blue Heron. Again, I'm pretty happy. I don't want it to look super unnatural. This is where I'll probably stop with this picture. All right, next we're gonna edit this mallard. Mallards are pretty common where I live. And you know, the challenge becomes with common species, getting uncommon pictures. So having that little bit of water drip down his beak after he got a sip from the lake adds something to the picture, right? It adds a little bit more story to the picture than just a mallard picture. So I quite like this picture. And we'll start off like the other ones. First, lens correction, remove chromatic aberration, enable profile corrections. And then let's bump this white balance to 5600. That kind of looks a little too orangey for my taste, so I'm going to bring that down to maybe 5300. Okay, I could live with that. Let's go ahead and do our crop. Again, you know, if I was following rule of thirds to the T, this is where I would be, and I'd be cutting off all of his tail, so I'm definitely not going to crop it that way. The other thing that's important with cropping is anytime your wildlife is looking in a direction, you want to try to have some negative space. It adds depth to the picture. So we're going to move this here. Let's make that a little bit bigger. There we go. Kind of like that crop. Maybe we'll work on the angle a little bit. Let's go the other way. Let's see what that looks like. It's a little bit too much, so we'll go back and reset the angle. There we go. And let's see if we can auto straighten it. Okay, that's where Lightroom thinks it ought to be. Yeah, I like that. Okay, we'll stick with that. Let's go ahead, mask our subject. Perfect. Let's bring up the exposure a tad. Let's bring up the contrast a tad. Highlights down. There we go. Let's bring up the shadows. There we go. Let's bring down the blacks. Could live with that. Let's bring up the saturation. Again, I want to use point color. I want to bump up the vibrance here of that beak. I want to do the same thing with this green here. Bring up the saturation, bring down the luminance, and then we will bring up our texture, clarity, and dehaze on the subject. Perfect. Next thing we'll do is work on the eye. Use our brush tool. There we go. Let's bring up the exposure, contrast, and then saturation. Again, kind of a noisy picture when you zoom in. I would definitely use some sort of noise reduction tool on this picture. Let's go back. All right, I quite like that. Now what I want to do is do something with the background. Let's see, let's select background. Kind of want to bump up the saturation and see what it does. Okay, that's good. That's good. Want to bring the texture down, clarity, and dehaze. And I also, in our basic section, I want to bring up the exposure a tad. It looks a little too much. There we go. Yeah, I would kind of keep it there. Again, this is a picture I would definitely run through Topaz, because removing the noise and adding a little bit of sharpness to this subject will make this picture really go to the next level. So don't be afraid to use those tools. All right, next we'll work on this Green Jay from La Lomita Photography Ranch. First thing, again, same concept, remove chromatic aberration, enable profile corrections. Now, here's another picture where I'm not going to be able to be perfect on the rule of thirds, because I'll be cutting off his wing or doing some weird things. So I'm going to kind of leave it like right there. I like that. Again, I find this really distracting. I want to use my remove tool and get rid of that. Perfect. Remove. All right, thank you, AI friend. Let's generate. Perfect, I'm happy with that. The background looks cleaner. Now we will do our white balance at 5600. Yeah, that actually looks really nice. I'm gonna leave it there, and then I wanna select my subject, but here I think I will use the object selection tool and start painting over the subject. And I hope that Lightroom will give us exactly what we need selected. Yeah, it did a pretty good job. I do want this area to be selected as well, so I'm going to clean that up, Didn't select some of the things, but that's certainly pretty good. Whenever you see birds with wings spread like this and you're using the masking tools, you want to be really careful that it's a clean selection, because if you select the bird and increase the contrast and have some of this background selected, it'll just make it look weird. So just remember that. Definitely want to bring the exposure up on him a little bit. Contrast for sure. It's a very pretty, colorful bird. Want to bring the highlights down a tad, shadows up, maybe too much up. Bring the blacks down just a tad. Now here, saturation is going to be up a little bit. There we go. Again, we're going to use the point color to bring up the saturation, bring down the luminance. Really pretty colors. I really want those colors to pop a little bit. And then there we go. Finally, we will do this green area. There we go. There we go. I am happy with that. Then we'll move on to increasing texture, clarity, and dehaze. Perfect. Next thing we're going to do is work on the eye. This was really good because I got a little bit of that sun reflection in his eye, and that definitely adds a lot of life into the picture. So again, we're going to increase the exposure, increase the contrast, increase the saturation. Perfect. Yeah, quite happy with that. I'm actually not going to do anything to the background because I think the background is fundamentally good out of the camera. I may want to increase the exposure a tad here. Yeah, there we go, brightened up a little bit. Perfect, that's pretty much it, and this is where I would export it and call it a day. Again, remember the key is not to make your pictures look unnatural. You want them to feel and look as natural as possible. Thanks for watching. If you found this content helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you have secret tips or techniques for Lightroom editing, please post them in the comments below. And remember, you can totally go out there and capture some amazing wildlife photography. So until next time, just get out there.